Yep, you're good to go.
So I can't see anything, but just talk.
Yep.
I can see and hear you.
Hello, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. I'm Andy Stephen, your moderator for today. So welcome to the second International Maritime Webinar Series. Today's one is called Blue Carbon for a Sustainable Blue Economy. This series of seminars has been highly successful. A fortnight ago, we had one related to how do we sustain the blue economy in a COVID normal context. We had more than 800 people attend. So those of you who have come back again, welcome back. Our topic today, Blue Carbon for a Sustainable Blue Economy, takes place as part of Ocean Week. I wanted to share with you some of the thoughts of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, who they're usually prime ministers and presidents of heads of state, have released a statement saying that they want to emphasize blue nature needs to be central to our thinking, and that a sustainable ocean should be seen not just as a conservation imperative, but also as a priority for our future of our economies, ecosystems, and society. Today, our series of 4 talks considers different aspects of blue carbon as part of the wider blue economy, including climate, science, finance, and livelihood perspectives. However, I want to make the point when we talk about blue carbon, we're not just talking about carbon per se, but we're talking about the range of different benefits that blue carbon ecosystems can provide in terms of their ability to give you protection from storms and tsunamis, as well as providing food, livelihood, and other opportunities for people. So just a few logistical matters before we get underway. We've got a series of 4 excellent presenters. I'll come to them shortly. You won't be able to ask questions verbally and at the end of each presentation. Rather, you'll find at the bottom of your screen a little box icon called Q&A. So it's the one with the 2 little chat boxes. You can post your question in there. Please note who you want to address the question to. We will collate those questions and we'll have a discussion Q&A time at the end of the 4 presentations. So our first speaker today, and he's just joined us, I think, Professor Daniel Muriaso from the Centre for International Forestry and Research will give the first presentation, Blue Carbon for a Sustainable Blue Economy, What Science Can Offer. Daniel is a principal scientist, as I said, at C4, but also at the Bogor Agricultural University. His work relates to land use change and biogeochemical cycling, climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. He was part of he served for the government of Indonesia as the Deputy Prime Minister of the Environment from 2001 through to 2002, and in 2007 was part of the Ipcc team that won the Nobel Peace Prize. So I'd like to introduce to you Professor Muriaso.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Thanks for giving me the opportunity, Andy. This is a very interesting topic to discuss today. And I would like to share with you, is it possible to share my screen?
Down the bottom,
yes.
Daniel.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you see them?
Not yet.
Good.
Okay, you're away.
All right. So what I'm going to share with you basically really is the science in blue carbon. How can science contribute in this blue carbon sustainable blue economy? I'm going to share mainly about mangrove, basically, because mangrove has been one of the most important ecosystem in blue carbon ecosystem, and it covers a lot of ground. And in the context of Indonesia, Australia, I think we share the first and the second largest mangrove covering the globe at the moment between Indonesia and Australia. We have somewhere around 3 million hectares, and Australia about 1.2 million. And that's already about a quarter or 1/3 of the global mangrove on Earth. So with that percentage, we can have a very useful conversation with regard to our common problem, common challenges, and also perhaps common understanding and knowledge on this area. So I think with regard to the topics of this webinar is how can we make this treasure or wealth monetized and useful for the livelihood of people. So if we look at the coastal zone, blue carbon, coastal blue carbon, you can immediately see this is mangrove. Very charismatic shape and stature of mangrove along the coastline. Avicennia is also called gray mangrove. You can see the layers of canopy. You can see also the mud in front of an estuarine, meaning that this ecosystem is so wealthy, managed to colonize the mud. And you can see the different height here. The colonization starts and then they grow very well at the background. And the second type of mangrove you can see usually is Rhizophora. So this is the second common mangrove across the world. And it's also called red mangrove, maybe because the propagular color is very glittering red. You can see it from the distance. Another type of ecosystem or mangrove ecosystem is the Sonerazia stand. You can also see Bruguera. Mainly this ecosystem are in the interior of mangrove. You can see the watermark there. It can be inundated up to 3 to 4 meters, but they still survive. This is mangrove. You can see the shape of the root system, like in Avicennia and also Rhizophora. They really are able to survive this inundation and large tidal range because they can inject oxygen in the soil. So blue carbon or coastal blue carbon really is very unique in terms of surviving the inundation, saline water, and also heavy wave and winds. So this is very important ecosystem in the coastline. And another aspect that we can see from the scientific point of view is the ability in storing carbon. This is the burial rate of blue carbon ecosystem, including salt marshes and seagrass, and mainly mangrove. It's 20 times much bigger than any terrestrial ecosystem. So how can they do that? Because of the high productivity. Mangrove can shed the leaves very quickly because it's very salty. The leaves can be dropped in relatively quick rate, and also the accumulation of fine root in the soil. So that's why the burial rate is so high. And most of the carbon stored in mangrove is below the ground. So that's another important fact about blue carbon ecosystem. So you can see tiny, perhaps very fragile looks of vegetation, but underneath it's huge treasure in terms of carbon. And that's also served various ecosystems services that they can provide to support the life along the coastlines, including biota, flora, and fauna that need to be monetized for important areas in addition to carbon. So from climate change perspective, with such a large storage of carbon, globally, blue carbon store about 11 billion tons. Our estimate in Indonesia, probably quite close in Australia, is about 3 billion tons. And if mangrove is kept, conserved, intact, that will be a huge asset. But if the rate of deforestation and degradation is allowed like what is happening now, one can lose about 200 million tons of carbon every year. And that's equivalent to 40 million cars on the road. So that's the mitigation message that we can share about how important it is to keep mangrove on the ground and restore the degraded ones. And from adaptation perspective, this is most recent report from the Global Commission on Adaptation. So if in the decade of ecosystem restoration, we invest 1.8 trillion, that was the plan. At the end of the decade, we can produce net benefit of 7 trillion. So it's more than almost five times higher than what's been invested in the beginning of this decade. So the message here I see it is that how can this investment involve local community, local people whose livelihood very much rely on this ecosystem. So one can share the benefits and also the wealth of this investment and the outcome of this investment with this kind of livelihood context. People living in the coastal zone, they get involved in the restoration and earn their living from the fish that they can catch. Our recent work with colleagues from Australia, led by Peter Grady, also indicates that it is very precious ecosystem. The ecosystem services that can be provided by blue carbon ecosystem, especially mangrove, is around $90,000. So that's compared with what is the existing terrestrial ecosystem like oil palm or red activities, which is around 4,000 to 8,000. This is 90,000. So it is a very valuable asset. And we have vast network scientifically to get the numbers correct on this thing, and more importantly, how to help government and also local community to benefit from this kind of asset. And last week it was published by another colleagues in Australia about the capacity of mangrove in coping with sea level rise. So this is another service that the blue carbon ecosystem can provide. Basically, it's been proven for millennia that mangrove can cope with sea level rise. And the green line here shows that it's been millennial context that this survival has been demonstrated by blue carbon ecosystem. And we just proved it very recently in a local context that yes, it accumulates. The accretion rate can be about 10 millimeter a year, and that's way above sea level rise increase or rate of increase. So ecotourism and also aquaculture are part of the wealth, and that was it's been part of that evaluation in terms of their ecosystem services. And again here, this picture reminds us how can these services benefits can be shared with local community. That's perhaps the core that we can put in a high agenda when we are talking about global agenda, be it Paris Agreement with 1.5 target of reducing or increase of temperature, and also the Aichi target, biodiversity convention, and more generally in this sustainable development goal. So blue carbon is right in the middle of this global agenda, and happily and nicely enough is that at the national level, government start to realizing how important it is to include blue carbon in the NDC processes. In countries like my own, it's been part of the national activities to include mangrove in that process. And also the use of the 2013 wetland supplement is very crucial to get the numbers correct, and suddenly coastal wetland, including mangrove, are there. So scientifically speaking, we are ready to help, and how can this effort be monetized, benefited by local community? That's my main message to you all with regard to the blue economy in the blue economy context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for a very good overview of blue carbon ecosystems and the diversity, but also showing us the range of services that they produce. We're now going to move on to our second presenter of the day. Steve Lutz is from Grid Arendal in Norway. Steve's works to advance the concept of blue carbon through national demonstrations. His experience includes development in the Abu Dhabi blue carbon demonstration, as well as the GEF, the Global Environment Facility's Blue Forest Project, which is the world's largest blue carbon initiative with project sites currently in South and North America, the Caribbean, East Africa, Middle East, and Asia. Over to you, Steve. You're on mute, I think, Steve.
Okay. Hold on a sec. Let me see how can I do that.
Let me put you on my screen.
Okay, I'm not on mute in mine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good now. Go.
Okay, so let me, are you seeing my my presentation?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay, so I have to share screen again. Hold on.
Yes, yeah, you do. Sorry.
Okay. You're seeing my screen now?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to chat just a wee bit about blue forests for blue economy, climate, society, and nature. And this essentially is a blue carbon plus approach, like the UN RED program, RED plus. And essentially what I'm going to be doing is it's a really good segue that Daniel started talking about the other ecosystem benefits that these ecosystems provide. And I think, you know, we've been working, a number of us have been working in blue carbon for quite a few years. And the focus, I think, is going from just looking at the carbon to looking at these other ecosystem benefits. And what I'm going to be talking about is how do we generate additional incentives from these other ecosystem benefits? Obviously, carbon, because that's the reason why we're here, is very important, but there's other ones as well. And that's what we're exploring through the Blue Forest Project and other initiatives around the world as well. Okay, thank you. So just to get the terminology right, blue carbon, carbon associated with coastal and open ocean ecosystems. And for us, for the purposes of this talk, blue forests essentially means harnessing the values of carbon and other ecosystem services to achieve goals in improved management, climate change, resilient communities, etc. Okay, a little bit of background. I coordinate and manage the Blue Forest Project, which is an initiative of the United Nations Environment Programme, and it includes support from the Global Environment Facility and many, many co-partners with the ones with, I think most of them are listed down below, but there's others there as well. And this has been an exploration since the beginning of 2015, where we've tested how to harness the value of carbon and other ecosystem benefits to achieve those goals. This year, we're developing guidance from that project. So hopefully there'll be some great guidance coming out from this project on not just community-based mangrove carbon projects, but also these how to set up these other sort of schemes or mechanisms for valuing carbon and these other ecosystem benefits and creating jobs. Okay. So in the context of the Blue Forest Project, and I apologize for this being a little bit busy, but these are the different types of pathways that we've explored how to harness blue carbon. So blue carbon is not just carbon finance. Carbon finance is just one aspect of blue carbon, but you can also use that value to address national policy and goals and managements like an existing wetlands policy or international commitments. So Daniel talked about the NDCs, of course. And then there's other ways that you can harness these benefits. So conservation agreements, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I'm not going to talk about the last one, is other mechanisms, but there has been some discussions about debt swap with the government of the Seychelles and how we could use that in a blue carbon context. It's a little bit outside of my scope, but I just just to let you know that's going on. So for us, the blue forest benefits, or the healthy blue carbon ecosystems, provide multiple blue economy options, okay? From carbon finance, fisheries, dye, aquaculture, and more. So the first one is obviously our experiences on carbon finance. And from our project, we have two project sites in Kenya, in Gazi and Vanga Bay, called Mikoko Pomoja, and then also in Assassin's Bay, Madagascar. And these projects were partner organizations. So these projects were developed and managed by the Kenya Marine Fisheries Research Institute and partners, and Blue Ventures, which is a UK-based NGO in Madagascar. And essentially, what we've been doing, the down and gritty stuff about the carbon finance, is through the Gazi Bay project, they've been receiving carbon finance for the past few years. And this carbon finance has supported coastal conservation and restoration activities, with the profit from the carbon finance going toward the communities. So for example, there's a photo here of a well. This freshwater well the building of this freshwater well was supported from the profit of the carbon finance. So this is in Gazi Bay and Mikoko Pomoja. It's the world's first working example of blue carbon. And what we've done with that project is we've replicated it within Kenya, in Vanga Bay, and also within Madagascar. And these projects are sort of in their preliminary stage. They just got into the voluntary carbon market. And so over the next few years, you're going to see lots of good news about how they can have similar impacts in other places. And we're exploring how to do this in Tanzania and other locations. So we've got proposals on the way. But basically, the carbon finance, conservation and restoration activities, plus additional jobs, plus additional community benefit. And then another project we had in the Blue Forest project via Conservation International is looking at setting up mangrove conservation agreements. And so it's essentially called the Socio Manglar project, which the government of Ecuador put forth, and what we've been supporting through Conservation International is to set up conservation agreements between the communities and the government. And what these conservation agreements do is that the government gives our grants exclusive access to the resources to these communities that have a historical background there. And the communities gain the first access to lucrative products of the ecosystem. In this case, it's the red mangrove crab and black shell. And these two items are extremely lucrative and popular commodities within Ecuador. They're so popular and lucrative that the government has actually banned export out of the country because they want to keep the market in the country. And I can testify that the crab is extremely tasty. So over 50,000 hectares of mangrove forests within Ecuador right now are managed within the Socio Manglar project. So this is direct economic benefit to the community. And then you have also, and Daniel spoke a little bit about this, ecotourism. So there's many different types of ecotourism that you can do with mangroves. This one comes to us from the World Wildlife Fund with support from Sweden. And basically what we're looking at here is mangrove homestay experiences where you can stay. Visitors can go out on the canoes, experience the traditional fishing practices, etc. And what this does is it supports the mangrove biodiversity, and also it gets money into the local communities. And obviously birding as well is extremely important. And then it's not just that, it's not just the tourism, but you have stuff like mangrove honey. And this is something that's been set up in multiple locations around the world. This is just one example here where you have, and the reason we put up this example is because there's a partnership here on on basically those bees in the mangroves, and you can harvest the honey and you can sell it as a product. But the interesting thing here is it's a partnership between Marriott hotels and resorts and the local villages. So this type of a partnership is something that we'd like to foster and encourage. There's also other locations where you have mangrove honey being sold on the international market. And it's not just the honey, but it's also a whole slew of these secondary products that you can make from the mangrove honey that you can also sell on the international market or in the local market as well. Shampoos, you can make conditioners. Shampoo and conditioners, I have not tried myself, you might see, but I've heard they're good. Then there's soaps, medicinal bands. I guess you can't see me because I'm bald. Okay, natural plants mixed with honey or beeswax. That was my joke, but anyway. And it's not just that, you have mangrove dye. So you can use the mangrove bark to actually make a dye that you can use with on fabrics. And this is also a project from Malaysia. And it's used in creating batik textiles and artwork. Oops. Also, there is, Also, you can take the mangrove propagules, so the seeds, and this is what they've done in the Pacific Islands, and they use this to boil down and actually make an ink, a black ink that they used for their traditional artwork. So this is from the seeds, from the bark, and from the roots that you can boil down. And this is, I'd say, a high-end tourism commodity as well. And then it's not just in the developing world, but in the developed world. And so, for example, in Norway, we have things such as cooking with seaweed, kelp pasta, and even kelp beer. I can testify that the beer is okay. It's not fantastic, but I'm sure they'll improve. And many of you in the blue carbon community probably know that kelp is sort of the next sort of thing that we're looking at as far as blue carbon. But there's also a drive to advance macroalgae as well. I don't know if we want to keep blue carbon, the definition of blue carbon, to just natural ecosystems, or maybe go the way of macroalgae. But there's large potential and large interest in developing that. So overall, the whole idea here is that if you use these multiple benefits, you can support communities through multiple benefits. And this means that you have additional revenue streams being generated from healthy blue forest ecosystems. So you're not just dependent on one revenue stream like carbon finance, but you have carbon finance and all these other types of activities from your mangrove forests going towards supporting sustainable livelihoods. Okay. And this is important because it reduces risk. So even if you're going to invest in a blue carbon sense, if you have all these other activities going on, then you can reduce the risk. And obviously as well, you can have the countries help with their SDGs and NDCs, as Daniel mentioned. But if you look over on the right of my slide here, you have these little houses represent ministries in government. Now, usually, if you just talk about blue carbon, you can talk to the Environment Ministry, and even if there's a climate department. But usually in developing nations, the environment ministries are the least funded ministries that they have. So, but if you can talk about these other benefits, and you can say that these other things that these ecosystems can do, then you can talk to multiple different types of ministries. So you're not just talking to the environment ministry, you're talking to ministry that relates to food security, it relates to commerce, trade, labor, etc., which I think is where we want to go with these ecosystems, because we want to give it as high a relevance as possible in these governments. And so, back to the NDCs. Well, this is actually reflected in NDCs. So late last year, we did a review of the existing NDCs about how blue carbon ecosystems or coastal wetlands are recognized in NDCs. And we found out that obviously the mitigation there, but it's not just the mitigation. You have, and these are the benefits that these ecosystems provide that are highlighted by different countries. Adaptation obviously is a big one. Fisheries, ecotourism, blue economy, protection from sea level rise, and other coastal protection, food security, energy resources, and water filtration and retention as well. So it's, I think for me and for the lessons from the Blue Forest Project, I think what we're going to be doing with blue carbon is advancing it in a blue forest economy approach. So blue carbon is one piece of the puzzle, but I think if we truly want sustainable communities, we have to say, well, what do the communities want? What do the nations want? And I think we're seeing that they want carbon, they want blue carbon, but they want more. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for really introducing us to the concept of blue forests and taking us for a whirlwind tour around the world and showing us really successful projects, showing us all the range of different products that can be produced, particularly from mangrove forests, and showing us some of the innovative partnerships that we all need to foster in terms of really thinking about these blue forest ecosystems. Our third speaker today is Dr. Andreas Hooton. He's the Deputy Director for Marine Conservation Small Islands within the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime and Investment Affairs. Andreas has been driven by strong interest in oceans and people for more than 17 years and has worked on this issue both in Indonesia and at international levels. He has expertise right across the fields of marine biochemistry, blue carbon, blue economy. He's in fact a pioneer of developing the Indonesia Blue Carbon Program and is a negotiator for oceans at the UNFCCC meetings. Thank you, Andreas. Over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Andy, for the opportunity. Can you hear me? Okay. I would like to give some introduction, brief information about how we could able to have a good ecosystem in a sustainable way. Daniel already mentioned a very deep how is the condition of the mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia in particular, and what is the contribution or the contribution of this blue carbon ecosystem, not only for the climate change issue, but as well for another issue like the issue for food and other things. Now, I would like to give some information as well, mostly about the blue carbon activities in Indonesia. Hello, can you? Okay, next slide. So this is, I would like to give some, because some of you may be wondering about what is blue economy actually. So basically blue economy is the sustainable use of the ocean resources based for the livelihood, for jobs, for other purposes. So based on the World Bank study, they value that our ocean economy is about 2.5 trillion annually, and it can be reached more than 3 trillions by 2030. So basically all of them goes through the food, energy, mineral, health, tourism, and transportation, and other things. Then could be support for millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world. So for blue carbon photovoltaic system, one of the benefits I think is about the climate change mitigation and adaptation. In Indonesia, in particular, we have important aspect for the contribution of the coastal ecosystem, mangrove or seagrasses, for adaptation, in particularly for the national food security, livelihood, resilience, as Pa Daniel and Steve already mentioned, that some contribution for coastal protection that already quite spend a lot of money by the many countries to protect their land from the ocean issue. And another thing is about the greenhouse mitigation, which is very important for us. I think how the contribution of the blue carbon uptaken the CO2 from the atmosphere and then restored in their body and then to the sediment. And as well, Pa Daniel already mentioned about the burial rate of the coastal ecosystem, which is very high in comparison with the terrestrial ecosystem. This figure giving us about very popular terminology in what we call it blue carbon dynamic issue. First, what we call it sequestration. Sequestration is when the vegetation is uptake the CO2 from the atmosphere, and then they keep it through the photosynthesis, and they store it into the leaves and branches and trunk and the root. And in the middle, it's called storage. So when the CO2 uptaken, then the vegetation use it for their metabolism and their growth. And once the steam or the leaf fall, then they accumulate it in the sediment, in the coastal or marine sediment, and then accumulated then for years, so that the burial carbon can remain stored for centuries or even longer than that. And once there is, on the third point is about the release. This is quite often occur in many areas, not only in Indonesia, also in many countries, that due to the human activities or the very strong natural activities, or like storm, something like that, could able to what we call it, to disturb the vegetation, the ecosystem, and then release the CO2 to the atmosphere back, and then it's becoming high density of CO2 goes to the atmosphere. And a part of that, I would like to see some of this figure. I think this figure on the left side here mentioned about the annual rate sequestration of the carbon by different ecosystem. So it's very clear that these are very different ecosystem, and they're mostly in the coastal ecosystem, mangrove, tidal marshes, seagrass meadow. They have very high sequestration rate compared to other ecosystem. And in the left side, in the below, there is a seagrass ecosystem, and then also mangrove ecosystem. Most of them are, I think from this figure, we could identify that the storage of the carbon itself mostly are located in the below ground rather than the above ground, something like that. All of the ecosystem, seagrass or mangrove, are very good for storing carbon in their sediment. And here again, from this figure, I think we can see very clear that from most of the study, I think the average of the biomass actually is about 20 to 30% of carbon storage, rather than the sediment or below ground of the sediment is about 70 to 80% of carbon storage in the ecosystem. This is just an average number. So this is tell us how the important that we could keep the sediment or the below ground material in a sustainable way, to avoid they could be able to release any time to the atmosphere as the anthropogenic CO2. This figure coming from the Bapenas ACCTF project, they are trying to modify several numbers. How is the importance of the blue carbon ecosystem in Indonesia, particularly in mangrove and seagrass. This is the number, some average of calculation that from many papers that the mangrove storage in the carbon storage in mangrove about 950 on average, and then for seagrass is very small in comparison to the mangrove ecosystem. But both have a very good benefit for nursery ground, for the fisheries, for artisanal fisheries, for protection of the coastal, and then reducing the energy from the wave and other things that can be useful for the human being. This is the recent study by one of our colleagues mentioned. I want to show you how the dynamic of in these three different ecosystem of carbon of mangrove ecosystem in different area in Indonesia. One is in Jawa, another in Kalimantan, and another side is the just small island, northern part of the Jakarta. So from this study, many of us are already just wondering where actually the carbon in the sediment coming from. I think before we can see how they have different abundance, that the organic carbon in the sediment is very high concentration rather than in the biomass. So mostly for the mangrove in this particular area, they are strongly influenced by the terrestrial. I think in the left side here, this is the way we could able to trace the source of the organic matter using the stable isotope composition of delta C13, and as well with the combination of the C-N ratio by plotting them into into this graph. We could able to identify where actually the source of the organic carbon. And from the study, we could identify that most of the good high abundance of the organic carbon were located in the area where there is a strong influence of the brackish water or land water, fresh water, and then seawater in here, in particularly in the Kalimantan. But in area where it is less influenced by the fresh water, usually they have a very low concentration of the organic carbon. This is what happened in the small island in the northern part of Jakarta. This is also gives you the idea how is the different ecosystem of mangrove ecosystem could able to derive different carbon stock in different locations in Indonesia. Here, this is from the small island in the northern part of Jakarta. Mostly the island is made of calcium carbonate. And this is in the central of Java. There's estuary, and this is also in the nearby the estuary area in Brau in the East Kalimantan. So we have very good figures that how different ecosystem could give us different source of organic carbon that influence to the concentration of the carbon in that particular area. And again, using this figure, they have actually the same number that most of them are in the range of the 20 to 30% of biomass, and then 70 to 80% of below ground sediment, that high concentration of the what you call it, carbon content. And another aspect, when we are talking about this kind of study, we are able to do some experiment about the carbon accumulation rate from the various countries. So in the above three, the area is in the East Kalimantan and Segara Anakan, and then below there are several area, not only Indonesia but also different countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Jakarta, Japan, China, Australia, Brazil, and other things. So from our study, we could able to see that the accumulation rate of the carbon accumulation rate were the highest in the East Kalimantan among other locations from previous study, which is almost maybe around almost 2,000 gram carbon per meter square per year. This is quite high accumulation rate of the carbon in this particular area. And this number actually is very important once we are trying to value the ecosystem services, not only for the climate change issue, but also for other things, that payment for ecosystem services and then red place, so that we could able to think that how useful, how big the contribution of mangrove ecosystem in particular area in terms of the absorption of the CO2 from the environment to their ecosystem. And now I would like to give just a bit, before Steve already mentioned about the carbon financial. I think actually there are several things that about the carbon financial, carbon pricing, and one is the method, we call it CCB standard. This is the abbreviation of the climate community biodiversity standard. And also there are CD VISTA. CD VISTA is the sustainable verified standard. And then VCS, VCS the verified carbon standard. So these are three the most common standard that being used for the carbon pricing globally. And in comparison with this, I think from the CCB here, CCB and then CD VISTA, I think they have very close relation. It's not only valuing the carbon in one ecosystem, but also another benefit coming from the environment. Let's say like a biodiversity and then other social benefits, something like that. So the carbon itself could able to bring a higher value in comparison if we are using the VCS method. This is the ordinary standard that being used for any carbon trading. I think so far it's more than 1,000 projects already being already going on regarding the VCS standard. Now, however, most of them, especially for the coastal ecosystem like a mangrove, most of them are dealing with the biomass only. So this is not good, I think, for country like Indonesia, that we need to count the ecosystem as the whole thing. It's not only biomass, above ground biomass. From the previous study, we already know that biomass actually is only 20 to 30% of the whole thing. So we need to focus that the whole thing is very important to able to be a part of the carbon pricing in the global carbon market. And also with the combination of the non-carbon benefit, it could able to bring more or even the higher price of the ecosystem value in that particular area in the future. So this is a wide variation of the carbon prices globally. I think this is coming from the World Bank numbers. So in general, the World Bank, there's a various of the carbon prices span from the $1, even though there is a project less than $1, until the highest is about 126 US dollar per ton CO2 equivalent. So this is quite very high. I don't know if this in our blue carbon we could able to have maybe 20% of this price. Is very fantastic. And this is a big challenge for us, I think, for the people who players with the carbon pricing and about the conservation issue, sustainable use, so that different area could able give different value depending on the what kind of product that you offer to the global market, something like that. If you just offer about the carbon, of course the price will be lesser if you then compare with the price of the one carbon, and then with combination with the what you call it, with the combination of the biodiversity. For example, I saw in Kalimantan, there's a project try to link between the orangutan habitat with the carbon price. So the price actually is very high compared to the area in the North Sumatra or Aceh. They try to value the mangrove ecosystem purely based on the biomass above ground. So this is yeah, it's not, the price could be different, very high different, something like that. And I think this is some of the introduction, and would like to thank you for the Andy and Matt for giving us the opportunity to share this information. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, very informative, telling us and really to us the need to invest in healthy ecosystems. The really collect and really made the point about the importance of source in terms of their ability to restore and really got those concepts across. and just the diverse processing systems. Andreas kindly in coastal vegetation reefs, and we managed. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Andy. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah, that's good, Matt.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everybody. And because we have several hundred Indonesian friends online, I can also say selamat sore, or an approximation of what it should be. So I just changed my talk title. As Stephen was talking, I was going to give a talk called Why Do We Need Blue Carbon Finance? But I think Stephen's convincing me that I need to broaden my concept because what I'm actually talking about is why do we need blue forest finance? I'll try to tell you why. So we've just had three excellent presentations, three of those that are going to be a little bit difficult for me to follow, but here we go. Fortunately, they've covered a lot of ground and I no longer have to. But Daniel, in the beginning, gave an excellent presentation where he talked about the broader set of services that blue carbon ecosystems can provide, not just climate, but also providing livelihoods and also the protection that they can give us from storms and floods. So giving us a bit of shelter from disasters. And Stephen followed up on that, and I can confirm, Stephen, that I also have not much need for the mangrove shampoo, although it does sound very interesting. So there are essentially two actions that we can perform in order to reap those benefits. So we've just seen how many benefits that we can reap, but in order to sort of get the benefits, there's really two things we need to do. And the first one is that we need to protect what we've got. We have been losing a lot. We've been cutting down our mangroves. We've been losing our seagrasses and our tidal marshes because the coasts are crowded and we want those spaces to do other things. But in order to make the space, we lose the benefits they provide. So we need to protect them, first of all. However, we've also heard that we've already lost a fair bit. So we need to restore what we have lost to the extent that we can. And we can do that to a very great extent. We can certainly, there's tens of thousands of hectares of degraded mangrove forests that we can restore, and the same can be said of seagrass meadows and tidal marshes, although we have a poorer understanding of what the scale of the problem is for those. Although I will, just on seagrass, note that yesterday on World Oceans Day, there was a significant report on seagrass that was released by the United Nations Environment Programme with the support of Grid Arundel. And jump online and you'll be able to find that, I'm sure. Daniel also mentioned this report, which tells us that if we do protect our mangroves and our seagrasses and our tidal marshes, and we do start restoring them, then the value that we get is huge. We can get these sort of staggering numbers, $1 trillion in benefits that we can get by doing that. But there is a bit of a sort of a fine print, I guess, in that story. In order to get those benefits, we have to spend some money. So the benefits are up to 10 times the cost. That means there is a cost, and that cost does sometimes happen up front. So that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. And I wanted to start with really talking through some of the different roles. Talking about the different roles, I think sometimes helps us to understand, how the different actors or the different stakeholders interact. So on the one hand, we have governments, and we know that governments do a range of important functions. They enact policies. For example, they might enact a policy that is a moratorium on mangrove clearing. They might also enact laws. So that's, I guess, policies with a bit more strength behind them. At an international level, like Daniel mentioned, with the Paris Agreement, they can enter into treaties. They could be binding treaties, or non-binding treaties. Importantly, they do generate a lot of funding, and that funds can be used to support the policies or implementation of the laws, and it can come in many forms. It can be grants, it can be in the forms of taxes, and it can also be in the form of the sort of the carbon trading that we've heard about. And I see that there's been a few questions come in on the carbon trading that perhaps we can unpack at the end. Then we've also got civil society, and by civil society, I mean really you and me, structured, but also unstructured, and they can be in the forms of NGOs, for example. A lot of great work gets done by NGOs, but even just as individuals, we can be important. And they have various roles that they play. These include things like philanthropy. Sometimes when we think of philanthropy, we think of wealthy individuals who give a lot of money. Sure, that's part of it, but even individuals without that much wealth can do it now through crowdfunding. So you can give $1 and it can make a difference. But even if you don't have the money to give, you can volunteer your time. And even beyond that, you can engage in activism, and that activism doesn't have to be in the form of protests on the streets. It certainly can be. It can be in a very small and subtle role. So by spending your money, you can engage in activism. For example, by choosing where you buy your seafood from. Is it from a sustainable fishery or from an unsustainable fishery? By choosing to buy your seafood from somewhere that's sustainable, that is a form of activism where you're showing what you want in society. And then on the other hand, there's business. Sometimes we think of business and companies as being in the game of making money. That's true to a large extent, but it's more than that. Businesses do lots of things. They are part of our society. They do engage in trade. They do a lot of investment, and they do a lot of donations as well. And there's a common theme through all of that, is that and that involves the money, exchange of money. So that money, if you put all of the actors together, we have an economy. We have governments, and we've got our private businesses, and we've got the civil society, NGOs, just regular people. They are the economy. Now, part of that economy is sort of the finance, and that's a sort of a specific role, I guess. So I guess I wanted to just disentangle some of the concepts of finance that we need to try and understand. So finance, for me, it's about the incentive structure that we need to achieve a certain set of goals. Now, we set the goals, and then finance provides the architecture for us to achieve those goals. So if we're saying our goals are protection and restoration of blue carbon ecosystems or coastal ecosystems, that's our goal. And so then we structure the finance in a way that helps us to achieve that goal. And we also might have a few steps that we want along the way. So we might want it to be done in a specific way. So for example, might want it to be done in an equitable way, and an ethical way. So we can put those constraints around the way that we use the finance so that it does what we want. So that's all great, but it can be confusing. There's lots of words that get thrown around, and those words are often a bit unfamiliar. And so in a meeting that we had at the start of the year, before we all had our travel plans a bit restricted, we started thinking about that. And we started thinking about how do we take the language of finance, which is a bit confusing and really a bit of a barrier to achieving the goals that we want, and start putting it into a framework and into a language which is simple. So this is a bit of an effort to do that, and I just wanted to give a couple of examples. So on the one hand, we've got things that most people are intuitively familiar with. So payments and loans. Payments, simply you buy something, you pay some money, and you get something in return. So Stephen mentioned mangrove honey. I've had mangrove honey. It's quite delicious. So in that case, I have a desire for something. So pay the mangrove farmers some money, and I get some honey in return. So that's a particular way of, I guess, of using that the framework of the market of the economy to provide an incentive for mangroves to exist. So if the mangroves exist, the bees can collect the nectar from the mangroves, and then the mangrove farmers can make their honey, and then they can sell it. So that's very simple. We also need to bear in mind that sometimes it isn't that simple, and there are some complexities in the kind of the chain that goes from, for example, a farmer or a fisher to the person that ultimately uses it at the end, and there's various complexities associated with that. I'll just take a drink from my throat there. But also, we also need to bear in mind that we need to use those opportunities in ways, and Stephen really alluded to that, where if, for example, we have a government policy which is about not cutting down mangroves, we need to provide the opportunities for the people who were relying on that mangrove wood, for example, for an income. So how can we support them to get an alternative income? So these kind of payment-based systems are one way to do that. And we can think of carbon markets the same way. Carbon markets do act at a much bigger scale and a bit differently, and we can have a discussion about that at the end if anyone's interested. So the markets are kind of simple. We more or less understand them. Then there are some things that are a bit more difficult to understand, and as an example, I thought I might give you the bonds. And again, Stephen mentioned bonds. So a bond is essentially a promise. I have a promise that I'm going to repay whoever's giving me the money, and that repayment might happen in 10 or 15 years. But in the meantime, I can spend that money on something that is important to me. And the Seychelles Bond is a really good example, where this was a government bond, and essentially there were $15 million US dollars that were provided by 3 big investors. The government of Seychelles has said to those investors, we will pay you back plus interest. So it's a good deal for you. They're able to do that because they've had the backing of some governments and some NGOs. And with that $15 million, on the one hand, they're using it to support development of sustainable fisheries, but also they're using it to implement marine park management. So the seagrass there on the right is a marine park in the Seychelles, and some of the funds from those bonds are being used to support the development of marine parks in the Seychelles. So the bonds are really, we think of them as enablers. They are there to provide a set of money that provides a scale of action that might not otherwise happen. But they're not always intuitive. Then a completely different type of finance is a sort of a risk-based finance, like insurance. Now, many people will be familiar with insurance because many people will have their, for example, their house insured. You pay an insurance company a fee, and then an insurance company then says, all right, if something happens to your house, we will help you repair it or replace it. Now you can get a discount on your fee if you fulfill certain conditions. For example, if you have a dog, and that dog is able to deter intruders, you might get a discount from your insurance company. The same can happen for something like mangroves, and this is really a field that's being developed. But the idea is that if we have a set of houses or assets like buildings behind a mangrove forest, where they receive much more protection from storms like Cyclone Amphan, which are the photos that are shown there, then there's some discounts that can be made, and those discounts can then be used to generate funds that can help protect the mangroves. But also there's types of insurance where everyone pays money into a pool that then is used to decrease the risk by, for example, making sure the mangroves are well cared for. So those are three different sorts of options, just to give, I guess, a very high level overview of what's available in terms of the finance for supporting blue forest. It's not all about carbon markets. A substantial proportion of it is. There's lots of other options for us. So if we put them all together, that brings us to a point where we can get government and civil society and business all working together for essentially mutual influence, mutual gains that then help support those actions that we're really interested in, and the protection and the restoration and then get all the benefits, the climate mitigation, the livelihoods, and the disaster risk mitigation as well. So with that, I will close. Terima kasih. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. And just a note that if you want to see any of the resources that some of us have been talking about, then you can look at that particular link there, and some of them are available for download. Back to you, Andy.
Thank you, Matt, for a great overview of financing options, an introduction to markets, and really starting to, again, reinforcing that point we're seeing all the way through about blue forests. It's good to see you doing things on the fly there, Matt. Our last speaker today is Dr. Tertius de Kluver. So he's from the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources in Australia. Today he's going to talk to us about accounting for blue carbon in Australia. Tertius is a senior policy analyst with the department, as I've said. His primary role is in the progressive implementation of the 2013 Wetlands Supplement for inclusion in Australia's annual National Inventory report to the UNFCCC. As a bit of background, Tertius trained as a marine scientist, and he's held various positions both in Australia and the USA that are academic, based in industry, and now in government. So over to you, Tertius.
Thanks very much, Andy. Am I online? Oh,
Right, good to go.
Sure.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to have a slightly more constrained talk today. I'm going to talk about what Australia has done to account for blue carbon under UNFCCC. This is a little bit about what's happened in the last 3 years or so, although the work has been going on for probably the last 5. Now, before I really start the talk, I'd like to first of all make a clarification as to how we see blue carbon in the context of reporting emissions and removals of carbon to the UNFCCC. And because we use guidance from the Ipcc, we use the guidance provided through the 2013 Wetland Supplement which basically is an additional guidance to the 2006 guidelines for greenhouse gas, compiling greenhouse gas inventories. So under the guidance, we're looking at basically areas that are vegetated by vascular plants that exist in tidal areas where the soil is partially covered or continuously covered by tidal freshwater or brackish or saline waters. Now, this captures things like mangroves and tidal marsh and seagrass. What it doesn't capture, and perhaps what is involved in the broader definition of blue carbon, are the non-vascular plants like the macro and microalgae. Although, funnily enough, I guess when we consider blue carbon in the context of an inventory, we almost invariably have to deal with the carbon that originates from those sources that gets swept in through tidal action into the mangrove or tidal marsh areas. But that's an issue of accounting rather than the actual modelling of what carbon is available. All right. So Australia's coastal wetlands are extensive, and a very good reason for the Australian government being interested in this particular area. Australia has an area of over 7.5 million square kilometres, a coastline that measures, depending upon how you measure it, but somewhere around 59,000 kilometres. So it's very extensive. And around that coastline, we have approximately 2.3 million hectares of tidal marsh, about 1.1 million hectares of mangrove, and an estimated 5 million hectares of seagrass meadows, but we continue to discover more seagrass as time goes on. It's perhaps, in a sense, our most hidden treasure in this particular compendium of blue carbon. So from that, it was estimated by Lawrence Baker and Lovelock that about 1% of Australia's terrestrial area stores around 5% of all the carbon in Australia's terrestrial ecosystems. So that's a substantial amount, and it goes again to show the ability of blue carbon habitats to sequester and store carbon for long periods of time. Now, within the Australian inventory, we have a framework under which we try to account for this carbon. Now, the National Greenhouse Gas Accounts, which are an annual report to the UNFCCC, has to meet a number of requirements. First of all, it meets Australia's reporting requirements to an international treaty, okay, to the UNFCCC itself. So that in itself is a reason for being. But it's not simply that particular issue that is covered by an informed inventory that's produced every year. It enables us to track our national emissions, because the inventory looks at as much of our human interaction with the natural world as well as our industrial actions that produce emissions, or if we're doing things to conserve carbon, to remove carbon from the atmosphere, then we also track those sorts of projects as well. We have the inventory also informs policymakers and the public. It gives, if you like, a context to, or a framework against which we can view how we are progressing and how policies are working in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions nationally. Now, the guidance that we use at this time is the 2006 Ipcc guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. And for that section in which I'm involved, I often work under Volume 4, the Guidance on Agriculture, Forestry and Other Land Use. And mangrove forests, from Australia's perspective, are forests for accounting purposes. And so they land underneath forests, our forests in general. But up until the supply or the production of the 2013 supplement, mangrove forests, although seen and accounted for, were treated in a sense as terrestrial forests. We had no mechanism, no guidance on by which to actually measure the change in carbon stock that occurred with anthropogenic activity. So if a mangrove forest was removed for some activity, such as the development of a port or a canal estate, then the emission factors and all of the other parameter values that we used in the modeling to estimate the loss of carbon related more to a terrestrial forest than it did to a mangrove forest. But with the production of the 2013 supplement, that allowed us to change that perspective. And I came in at about the time in 2015 when it was decided that we should actually implement the 2013 supplement in a progressive manner. And the first chapter that we started to implement was Chapter 4 on coastal wetlands. So the sort of activities that we currently refer to, and I'm sure that many people such as Andy will remember Cleveland in the old days. This is my old stomping ground. I worked at the CSIRO laboratories in Cleveland back in the early 80s, when everything looked like the picture at the top. You had extensive tidal marsh and wetland, some mangrove and extensive seagrass beds just offshore in an area that was called Raby Bay. The picture below it is Raby Bay as it was in 2014, with continuous development of canal estates, industrial estates, marinas, and so on. That has led to the destruction of much of that habitat. So that is a loss of carbon that is estimated in our accounts. We also have the other side of the picture where we revegetate and create wetlands as an offset to projects that might remove wetlands. So the Shute Harbour Marina project in North Queensland is one such, where an area of mangrove was removed to allow for the expansion of the marina at Shute Harbour, but that was offset through the creation of, it was almost a protective barrier to that marina project, which was then stabilised through the creation of a mangrove in that area. Other things that we might also look at, account for, the impacts of aquaculture. In other words, things like, and this is a sort of an offshoot to blue carbon, but the fact is that aquaculture does occur in many blue carbon habitats. And one of the issues is the release of nitrogen through feeding of finfish and crustacea in those aquaculture ponds, and we account for that as well. We are expanding the range of activities that we report on as time goes on. So the activity data that we use, if you like, is the area of observed change in a habitat. So whether it be an area of mangrove or tidal marsh, or in the picture below, actually in seagrass, in a seagrass bed or meadow. Our primary source of data, if you like, for observing such change is through Landsat imagery. So this is obviously useful in terrestrial and coastal work, but it becomes a little bit less, well, it's actually not particularly useful at this stage when it comes to submerged seagrass meadows. We simply don't get sufficient resolution to see all of the changes in the seagrass extent through Landsat imagery. So that requires another means of trying to realize what area of change has occurred. So with particular respect to seagrass, I do look at all known capital dredging projects around Australia and overlay, if you like, the dredge channel over surveyed areas of seagrass. That's the data for which exists in various repositories around Australia. So whether it be with the universities, the state governments, and in some cases also some private institutions. I'm sure that Andy knows, and in fact, control, if you like, through his work, manages much of that data through the TERN dataset. So there is a lot of different sources of data that I can use. My problem is in trying to get as universal a look at that data as I can. But Landsat imagery is our major source of data and what we use for our, if you like, above water blue carbon habitats, our mangroves and our tidal marshes. So having an idea as to what's changed at a particular locality, whether we see a mangrove springing up, growing because somebody's planted a few hectares of mangrove or because somebody's removed some mangroves to allow for development, we have to estimate the amount of carbon that's actually lost or gained through that particular process. Now, the Ipcc guidance provides methodology that can be followed at 3 different tier levels, if you like. Tier 1 is a simple methodology which basically says, at the simplest, you have an area of change, for example, an area of loss, that's multiplied by an emission factor. And the emission factor is, in some cases, simply a default value that can be provided through the Ipcc guidance. That says that for these particular pools, you will have lost this much carbon per hectare for a typical mangrove at this particular location, or this particular type of mangrove in a tropical location. So whether it's tropical wet or tropical dry, whether it's subtropical, or in Australia's case, we go all the way down to temperate mangroves as well. So that's a fairly simple method. Tier 2 allows you to, through published data, to work out better values for those emission factor and parameter values for your models, so that you can get a more precise, localized estimate for those carbon pools. Now, the carbon pools, by the way, that we look at are above and below ground biomass, soil carbon, and also litter, both woody and non-woody litter. So it gives you 5 pools that we can report against. Tier 3 is the highest level of modeling that you might want to engage with. It normally is numerical modeling, which requires significant computer capability. And for much of our terrestrial forest, well, our terrestrial forest modeling, for example, is undertaken at tier 3 level, except for the mangrove modeling at this time, because we haven't yet moved the mangrove models into our Tier 3 modelling framework that we have here in Australia. Now, Tier 3 is often not described in detail because there are a number of ways that you can actually go about it. But we have, over a number of years, probably the last 15 years, developed what is known as FullCam, which is our full carbon accounting model, which I will describe a little bit later on. So when I started this particular project for doing some initial modeling on carbon change associated with anthropogenic activity in our blue carbon habitats, I did some simple empirical modeling. And basically, again, it was based on parameter values that were available through the literature, that were regionally specific, species specific where possible, and where where species distribution and, if you like, the forest structure or the habitat structure, amount of bare area that you had available. Australia has, over a period of time, done some extensive surveys around its coastline, and the East Coast in particular is well served by those through surveys done in Queensland and in New South Wales, reasonable surveys done in Victoria, to a lesser extent because our northern and western regions are more sparsely populated. So Northern Territory and Western Australia, for example, have reasonable surveys, but they're not as complete. Okay. Now, in all of my modelling, I've applied one Tier 1 assumption, that mineralisation of disturbed organic carbon is instantaneous in the year of removal. So my current models don't have decay functions associated with them, but that's about to change. So for an example, I'll look at a mangrove growth as my approach to modelling for how carbon might accumulate in an area where we observe mangrove growth due to planting of a mangrove in an area. So I've applied this for simplifying the modelling. I've applied this at a forest community level rather than the species level. Although I have to say that my first model actually is in the removal of mangrove, and I did that modelling based on both the species that were available in a particular region and, if you like, the forest structure that was known. So what was the dominant species, or 2 or 3 species. In that modelling, I basically looked at up to about 7 different species of mangrove. But in this particular model, having gone through that work initially in the excavation models, I was then able to, through weighted means, develop something about mean values for the forests in areas around Australia. I also had to search for a growth equation that could accommodate mangrove growth, which is a little bit different to often to terrestrial tree growth. Seedlings and saplings and mangroves can stay around for periods of years in the right circumstances, so that you may not actually see much growth happening in an area until conditions, in other words, until there is some space in the canopy arises that allows for growth then of mangroves in that particular area. And I found a specific sigmoidal equation that was developed by Lutz and modified it according to procedure by Shi et al. And I've given that information there. Again, I've applied this model, or this equation, if you like, across each of the carbon pools. Now, that's strictly not realistic in the sense that there's always going to be, as the tree grows, there's going to be some variation in terms of the elementary values between litter production and above ground biomass, for example, or between above ground biomass and below ground biomass. In doing it this way, I assume that those ratios stay the same all the way throughout the period, but that's not strictly correct, but as an approximation, it does work reasonably well. Now, I've also, because of there's not a lot of data in Australia about, that I've yet been able to find, about the length of time it takes to grow a mangrove forest. In fact, some of the data that I did procure was from WA, from Western Australia, and there is more data available, but it's international data, some of which comes from Indonesia, some from Malaysia, that would be good to look at, perhaps in relation to our tropical wet mangroves in North Queensland. So to do this modelling, I use a simple spreadsheet model. Well, it's not that simple, but I'd like to simply demonstrate that one of the things about engaging in this activity, about establishing a blue carbon account for reporting under UNFCCC, is you can start simply, and there is a lot of data that's available for Indonesia and for Malaysia and for Southeast Asia in general that can be applied in a similar way to what I have done to establish accounts. You don't need to do tier 3 modelling to begin from the get-go. That's simply not possible. And it's certainly taken me a fair amount of time to gather enough information to even put this together. The model on the spreadsheet gets to be fairly large. The growth model, basically, when it's all put together, has about 1 million active cells. But in itself, it's quite simple. And again, it comes down to simply applying what is effectively a simple equation where your area multiplied by an emission factor will give you the amount of carbon that's the change in the carbon, either with respect to growth or with respect to excavation or removal, and you apply that to each of the pools. The issue about, the issue that you see here about suddenly topping out at a certain point is an artifact of the model, but works well from the accounting side of things, even though, again, it's not what you would see naturally. From the accounting point of view, once a forest reaches its maturity, you will have losses and gains that are more or less in equilibrium. So I'm not at this point accounting for further accretion through the entrapment of sediment. And there's a reason for that at this time. Much of what's trapped in sediments that's accreted through mangroves has an allochthonous source. That is, it comes from outside of the mangrove. What I'm really accounting for is what the mangrove is doing in itself. That is, the accumulation of the carbon in the soil is really through the accumulation and the slow transformation of particularly fine roots from the mangrove trees, and the allogenous sources of carbon, whether it be through terrestrial carbon washed down through the streams, or ceston and phytoplankton and remains of macro algae coming in on the tides. That is also part of the story, but as yet isn't particularly well reported. It's
Just 2 minutes to go.
Yep, that's good. So the important areas that we have, well, the important sources of information that I've used are the refereed papers and data from Australian wetland scientists, state and territorial wetland managers, and started off with simply 2 workshops, maybe in 2015 and 16, to start to accumulate some of that data. More important and more recent work that Andy is very well aware of, because he was a leader in this, was the Marine and Coastal Carbon Biogeochemistry Cluster that in 2013 through to 2015 did work around Australia to establish biomass and soil carbon values for the 3 blue carbon habitats that we've talked about. And that work has now recently, much of that work has been published and is now beginning to inform my modelling as well. Lastly, to go for our next steps, we are going to progress through and put mangroves into full cam, and eventually the tidal marshes as well. But we're starting with mangroves because, again, we have most information about those and we have good satellite coverage on that. The Tier 3 model will allow us to do a number of things so that we can actually model different transitions over time. Currently, with current modeling, I can't join for example, the regrowth of mangrove onto an area that was previously deforested. So it's hard to actually determine, for example, the impact of a remediation project. So this will allow us to do that. And also importantly, this gives us full integration of mangroves into the forest account so that we can eliminate the possibility of double counting and transcription errors and simplify some of our other accounting requirements. Okay, and thank you. Sometimes I also lived in areas where there wasn't a lot of mangroves, as I did in Maryland in the US. Thanks very much. I'm quite happy for my presentation to be made available, and initial contact details are through this. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Tertius, for a very good overview of what Australia is currently doing around its inventory systems. We've now got some time for some questions. In fact, our panelists have all been very actively answering. I think they've answered 34 of the questions that have come through, so thank you all for your questions. In fact, we've got 10 open questions currently, so we might move through some of those. I know Steve Lutz has to get away very shortly, so I'm going to send the first question to Steve. It's from Milika Stankovic. The existing projects for carbon finance are based solely on conservation of existing ecosystems or restoration of existing degraded systems, or a combination of both?
Am I muted? Could you unmute me? Okay, good.
Yep, you're good.
Right. So the current projects that exist on the voluntary carbon market for mangrove carbon include both conservation and restoration activities. So essentially you're conserving an area and part of the carbon finance goes to patrolling of that area. And then there's restoration. So the community is actually out there planting mangroves to make new forest. So it's both. That's so far.
Thank you, Steve. Question, I think, probably best taken by Andreas. Firstly, thank you for a wonderful presentation, but this is sort of an anonymous attendee. I wonder what the Indonesian government's stance on growing blue carbon finance for sustainable livelihoods, particularly reforestation, is, as we see a lot of mangroves already cut down for property development and aquaculture. Andreas, can you answer that one?
Yes, I'm trying to answer that question. I think the unsustainable fisheries or aquaculture is a big problem in Indonesia at the moment. And the current government, they are trying to first to restore the already destroyed the mangrove ecosystem due to the aquaculture and try to make the rule to minimize the movement of we call it the aquaculture people to expand their business to another area, which is usually a good mangrove ecosystem there. Regarding the finance, carbon financing, I think currently, I think the government of Indonesia now is on progress of making the regulation. I think together with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, we are hoping that in this year, we call it PERPRES, Presidential Decree on carbon pricing, could be launched in this year, so that it could some people could benefit from this kind of new regulation, how to manage or how to apply about the issue of financing to the not only for the coastal ecosystem but also for the terrestrial forest. Okay.
Thank you, Andreas. While we've got you, another quick question I think you can answer here, again from Anonymous. Is it true that Kalimantan has a higher CAR than Papua, considering Papua holds pristine mangrove ecosystems?
Yeah, that's what papers say. I mean, our study in Kalimantan is Kalimantan from the study site showing that's the higher of the carbon accumulation rate in comparison in the Papua. But I think this is only one point. If you maybe another part of the Papua, if you can compare the value, I think they can have different number of the carbon accumulation rate. Yeah, and about the pristine, this carbon accumulation rate doesn't really have a link with the pristine or not pristine, but this is mostly about how is the sediment being accumulated in that particular coastal coastal ecosystem, something like that. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Quick one for Steve before he comes through that just has come through on the Q&A. Steve, what is the solution in balancing the economic needs of coastal communities and maintaining mangrove forests as a source of carbon?
Okay, that's kind of a big question, but I'll try to give it a stab at it. And that is, we have to promote as many sustainable uses as possible while providing offsets to the unsustainable ones. And that was actually a couple other questions that I got. It was about what can you have? What they've done is they've planted casuarina forests as an offset to the mangrove tree, the mangrove wood, the use of mangrove wood. So that's one way. But I think looking forward, I think the whole blue forests or blue forest economy approach would be something that we should promote for maximum sustainability from these different things. I mean, we spoke about the carbon, we spoke a lot about the carbon, but there's also the mangrove crabs and these other things that these ecosystems can provide. And it's not just that. I mean, there's medicinal things, there's a whole slew of them. We're actually putting a blue forest economy report out soon, which will identify all of these different types of options. So I hope that's answered the question.
Thanks, Steve. It's great. A question for Daniel from Agung Bimo, who's been reading a lot of your papers, Daniel. And his questions are, we noted the top 3 sequestrations were mangroves, seagrass, and wetlands. So the question is, for wetlands, is wetlands included in the NDC, and what is the current conservation/restoration efforts to this matter? And the second question, for mangrove, is it only mangrove and estuarine systems that is counted in the NDC, or are mangroves from within the broader mangrove ecosystem, I presume he means oceanic mangroves, are they included? Is Daniel still there?
Unmute. You make the unmute of the mic. Yes.
I think you're still on mute, Daniel.
Is it okay now?
It's good, Daniel. Yep.
Sorry. Well, let's go back to the definition, what wetland and what mangrove is. Basically, wetland cover a very wide range of ecosystem, ranging from box, mires, peatland, all sort of things, including rice field wetland. In the Ipcc guideline, what we are talking about with regard to accounting for blue carbon in wetland using the wetland supplement, it involves peatland, both re-wetted peatland as well as drained peatland, and coastal forests, including mangroves, seagrass, and salt marshes. So those are wetland that is going to be accounted for in terms of inventory, in terms of project using the Ipcc guideline. And blue carbon, as it was well defined, it covers carbon in the open ocean as well as coastal carbon, including mangrove and seagrass and salt marshes. So by definition, mangrove is one of the important blue carbon ecosystem and also wetland ecosystem. So with regard to which one are included, as you may know that there are many different kind of mangrove based on the location, or the technical term is called hydrogeomorphic setting. It can be riverine, it can be estuarine, or open ocean fringing mangrove. So all of them are wetland and all of them are mangrove for blue carbon ecosystem. So hopefully in the accounting, they can cover this ecosystem in various hydrogeomorphic settings. The problem if we use the remote sensing, as Tertius mentioned earlier, these strips of vegetation along the coast are very difficult to identify if you do not use a fine resolution of remote sensing. So the only way to do is just go to the field, doing inventory and measure it, and then record very well your geographic location, and then lock it in the GIS or whatever map where mangrove are accounted for in the inventory. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Question for Tertius, or a couple in fact, Tertius. Firstly, is seagrass being considered as tier 2 or tier 1? And a second question was your model for mangroves available anywhere?
Okay, seagrass at the moment is a simple tier 1. I have insufficient information at this time. One of the problems with seagrass modelling in this particular setting is that you're not always sure of not just the extent of seagrass, but also its condition, its density, whether you're dealing with a very dense meadow or whether you're dealing with a fairly sparse meadow, whether that changes. Seagrass is impacted by a lot of coastal influences, so sedimentation can have particular impacts in many of our coastal locations after rainfall events. Our seasonal, many of our rainfall events are seasonal, so that you have possibility of on the east coast of Australia, particularly in Queensland, of seagrass beds being covered by sediment. Certainly, we lost a lot of seagrass beds, for example, in Moreton Bay recently through, or several years ago, through large rainfall events when those occur. So the surveys that were done are always just a point in time. So you have an idea of the extent, but you can't rely on those seagrass beds retaining the quality that was recorded at that particular time. In a lot of cases, that information in itself isn't always available either, simply the extent and not the quality. So I have to make some assumptions, and as such, I fall back to default values as, if you like, the fairest way to account for the losses. The other aspect of this is that we know from research that's been done in Australia and elsewhere that when you do dig your initial channel, that will have impacts beyond the area that was dug. However, again, I don't model what actually happens beyond the area of the channel itself. It's this particular account causes me some heartache in that particular sense, because I know that we should actually be somehow accounting for, if you like, the reduction in the vigor of that meadow beyond the loss of the meadow, the direct loss of that meadow due to the channel being dug. So I leave it as a tier 1, and in the hope that in the years to come, and through collaborative work with scientists here and elsewhere, and through increased reporting in the literature, that we get a better idea of not only what's out there, but what the impacts are. My real problem is simply having good information about the meadows that are impacted. That's not always available.
Thanks, Tertius.
Yeah. And for my mangrove model, the model is actually described in the National Inventory report that is out every year. So go to the UNFCCC website, look at the National Inventory reports, look for the Australian report. It's in the appendices in Volume 2, and again, it's simply setting up a spreadsheet with the simple equations that I've used. I'm quite willing to share that model should the request come through.
Thanks very much, Tertius. We're close to winding up now, everyone. I just wanted to share with you a couple of logistics. Look, we've had more than 220 people attend, which has been great. A number of questions around certificates. Yes, we will be producing certificates. So Mark Wilson will be sending those out to those of you who want them. So if you could contact Mark for that. The presentations, I'm pretty sure, will all be available. We're just getting the final approvals from all the different presenters, but I'm sure that they'll all be fine with that. So we'll get those out to you. Just to sort of finish off, I was really, we've seen across all of these presentations how we've started, a conversation about blue carbon, but really the framing has moved to talking about blue forests, so the broader suite of ecosystem services. One of the challenges that we've had in terms of, several years ago of, people were confused between what blue carbon was and what its relationship to the blue economy. But so in that context of a moving frame, if you like, I'm going to ask each of the panelists in closing to just sort of say, particularly in a now a COVID environment where we can't have a lot of the forums, such as the COP meetings to get together. What do you see as the priorities about how we really take this forward in terms of, making sure that we engage in a broader set of, recognising a broader set of ecosystem services that mangroves, seagrasses and salt marsh will afford? I might give the question first to Dr. Matt to answer. Thanks. Actually, no, sorry, I know Steve's got to get away, so I'm going to give it to Steve straight away.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think looking forward, if you look at the impacts of the current pandemic, sadly, they may be resulting in more degradation of coastal blue carbon, blue forest ecosystems because, there's going to be less ecotourism revenue going to these places. So there may be increased potential for poaching or these unsustainable activities. But overall, in the long run, if you have healthy coastal ecosystems, then your communities will have increased resilience, not only to the impacts of climate change, but the impacts of other extreme events like this pandemic. And sad to say, this pandemic is only one pandemic, and I'm sure we're going to get more. But I think, the UN Environment and many others are saying, let's rebuild in a smarter way. And I think harnessing these other more sustainable nature-based blue economy options is a really good part of that. So I think for us as a community, we have to, blue carbon got introduced a few years ago. Blue carbon can evolve, and it's, these concepts are not meant to be static. So let's evolve it and listen to what countries and what communities need. And I think that's the future of blue carbon. I think blue carbon is going to work out really well for a certain number of communities, but some places it might not work. And some places it may be the blue forest benefits. But at the end of the day, it's all about the healthy coastal and marine ecosystems. So I'll leave it at that, but I do have to run off because I've got a hard thing. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the presentation and comments.
Thanks, Steve.
Cheers.
Cheers, mate.
Over to you, Dr. Matt.
Thank you, Dr. Andy. So I guess for me, over the last few decades, there's been two trends in the world that have been very striking. The one trend is global warming. The other trend is a decrease in global poverty. But now, with the result of COVID, the World Bank has said, in fact, the declining trend in global poverty is going to start being reversed, certainly in the short term. So now we've got two big problems on our hands. We've got the climate and the ocean warming, as well as increasing poverty. So that says to me, more than ever, the sustainable blue economy is going to be central to our recovery and to our efforts to combating climate change. Now, the blue forest economy is a part of that broader blue economy, but it's a really, really important part. And so in all the activities that we try and implement, for me, it's going to be very important that we do several things. And first of all, it's leave no one behind. Let's make sure that livelihoods become central to what we do. Let's make sure that we build and rebuild in a sort of a way that respects the limits of nature, as well as respects that people need to earn a living and to feed their families. And if we do that, I think we're in a really good position, because these blue carbon ecosystems can provide so many benefits.
Thank you, Matt. I'll go to Andreas for a comment and a reflection.
Yeah, when we are thinking about the healthy ocean, and try to invest how to achieve unhealthy ocean if our coastal ecosystem is not in a good way. So in the global perspective and as well in the national perspective, the coastal ecosystem in Indonesia is very big, significant support, not only for the climate change, but as well the important thing is for the livelihood. So many activities are related to the coastal ecosystem, and particularly those who are working in the fisheries sector. Many artisanal fisheries are depending from the coastal ecosystem. And through this forum, I would like to ask all of us to think beyond the carbon itself, things about the livelihood and things about the community in order to have sustainable of the coastal ecosystem, and then we will have very good or healthy ocean ecosystem. I think that's my comment, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Tertius?
Just thinking about Australia, vast landmass, much of our population distributed along the coast, but still vast areas of coastline that are, if not unpopulated, very underpopulated. And what was observed not long ago was the loss of about 7,000 hectares of mangrove in the Gulf of Carpentaria. But it was observed after the event, because it was simply through the reports of a number of remote fishermen that brought this to the attention of the wider community. We didn't realize it happened until after the event, almost. For me, you have to have the buy-in of the local people who rely on their coastline for their livelihoods, who rely on it for the resources that allow them to not simply survive, but to prosper. We also need to work with local people to develop the management plans, to develop the strategies to go forward. It can't be a top-down approach. It has to be a bottom-up approach where you have that local buy-in. There's no other way in which you are going to be able to get the results over time. If it's top-down, people will simply abuse the system, as has happened in the past, where you have local community buy-in, people who know the areas well, who know what's required, who know through lifetimes, generations of living in that area, how best to manage it. It's a combination of knowledge as well as community effort that's required. So there is what I'd like to see.
Great, thank you. And the final word I'm going to give to Daniel for a wrap-up comment.
Thank you, Andy. Well, if Celsius mentioned about the land mass of Australia, I'm offering the sea mass of Indonesia.
Oh yeah.
And the length of the coastline, which is the second longest in the world, 91,000 kilometers or so.
Brilliant.
108.
Okay, it's a lot. Anyway, so with that kind of perspective, it is very important to think about blue carbon ecosystem in the context of islands or archipelagic countries, and in many cases, it's also small islands, which are very vulnerable to sea level rise, very vulnerable to land use change as well. So it's spread across the equator with different kind of challenges. On Java, it's very much degraded and need a lot of restoration effort. In Papua, it's very intact and need a lot of conservation effort. So where are the trade-offs between conservation and restoration? It's everywhere. We talk about different kind of situation in terms of intactness of the mangrove. In my presentation, I emphasize a lot on the sustainable livelihood rather than sustainable blue economy at large, simply because I think it's been mentioned by other colleagues that the coastal community are the one who are the hardest hit by this corona pandemic. So what's going to happen in the next, 5-10 years? The recovery process will cause a lot of implication in terms of blue carbon ecosystem. So if the arrangement between central or national and subnational government will be arranged in such a way that there will be a trade-off between blue carbon benefits for international or national reporting and the local livelihood benefits for, other than carbon benefits, that will be a beautiful arrangement and will last for a long time if the arrangement is set, although not on stone, but clear understanding between national and subnational government. Okay, you get the carbon benefit, I will get the co-benefit, or perhaps the main benefit, which is the ecosystem services at the national, subnational level. So this will be a huge agenda as far as Indonesia blue carbon and blue economy is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for those comments, and thank you to all the panelists for both your presentations and great insightful comments. To those attending, thank you for your attendance. Now, there's two people in the background making things happen, so I'd like to acknowledge Mark Wilson from CSIRO and Mr. Bayu from Lippi for making these events run seamlessly. So thank you both for making it happen for us. Not quite sure when the next presentation or webinar is going to be, maybe in a fortnight's time, but we'll be in touch. So please stay safe and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye.
Di rumah aja, Pak.